This is King World News. I'm Eric King, and you're about to hear an extremely powerful interview from our Meeting in the Aisle segment with Dr. Rand Paul, son of Congressman Ron Paul, who is running for U.S. Senate in 2010. Remember to go to our homepage at www.kingworldnews.com for more interviews, where this week we also have part 2 of the James Steins interview, Bill Fleckenstein of Fleckenstein Capital, as well as CEO Peter Barnes of Silver Wheaton. Joining us now is the future Senator of Kentucky, Dr. Rand Paul. Dr. Rand Paul's father, for those who don't know this already, is Congressman Ron Paul. Rand, let's start off talking about this massive debt that the country is facing. Talk to listeners about that.
Well, I think the problems we face with the debt are no longer an academic question. I think the problems we face are imminent and significant. You know, people talk about discussing their differences in the parlor, what we call parlor talk. It's no longer that anymore. I think the size and scope of the deficit is so huge that there's going to be ramifications, not only in the future, people talk about their kids and grandkids paying for the debt. I think we're going to pay for it sooner through inflation. And I think if we can link up those issues, we can get a lot of people coming to vote for us that hadn't in the past by linking the debt to inflation. And inflation hurts the working class and those on fixed income the worst. So I think we can get a lot of those people coming our direction by explaining the issue well.
I know you're kind of a student of history, and you'll look at, say, the late 1920s before we had the crash and look at the debt to GDP as a percentage being roughly 260% or so. We're so far beyond that now, Rand.
Well, we have a deficit this year will be 13% of gross national product. We've got federal spending at 28% of gross national product. I saw a statistic the other day. We spend money at $53,000 a second. I think there's not many people in our country who don't think that this is out of control. I think the growth of the Tea Party movement, you had several 100,000 people in Washington yesterday. It's amazing the discontent out there. And the discontent is not just those who are unhappy with President Obama. They're unhappy really with what happened under the Republican administration as well. They don't just want lower taxes. They want a government that doesn't spend an enormous amount that they don't have. They're worried that we now owe the Chinese $700 billion, the Japanese $700 billion, the Saudis $100 billion. We're the greatest debtor nation known to man, and people are worried about it.
But isn't this, in the end, Rand, entirely unethical that we're doing this, that we're saddling or burdening the future generations with this massive debt? How irresponsible is this?
Well, it's kind of like theft in a way. When you steal someone's purchasing power, it's a very silent and insidious form of theft, but it's the way that the government steals wealth from people. They steal wealth from people, particularly if you've earned your wealth and you're retired and you're not earning new wealth. You have that wealth, and if it's denominated in dollars and you have 10% inflation, the government's stealing 10%. In the old days, the days of coinage, they did it, and they would mix in base metals. They'd mix in copper with their silver, or they'd clip the coins. They'd make the coins smaller. And the public could judge it pretty quickly by palming their dollar, and they could tell that it didn't weigh as much. Now your dollar looks the same. It just purchases less at the store, and some people get confused. They go and oil prices are higher, or this and that prices are higher. They think that it's some kind of conspiracy by people, but they don't understand that really what it is the destruction of their dollar.
Right, but if you go back to Roman times, the Romans being clever like they were, their treasury was being depleted, right, Rand? So they would basically, as you said, mix in these other base metals. So they would take some of these other metals and mix silver in with it and sort of acid bathe it and shine it up and then do the process again and again and again. Well, pretty soon when they handed it out to the public, it looked like the silver coin. It looked like it was the same coin. But, of course, over time it wore off, and then the currency collapsed, and it was very collapsing to the empire. So isn't that what we're talking about here, is the risk of collapse for the United States if this continues unabated?
Well, I think when you get to a point of runaway inflation, you do. When the public became wise in Roman times, often the Roman leader would lose their head. As the public becomes wise now, it may be like it happened in 1923 in Germany. As the money was destroyed and people went around with wheelbarrows full of money, you had chaos, and out of that chaos, people wanted a strong leader, and people voted in a Hitler. And that's not to say that that's going to happen, but it is worrisome that in times of crisis, I think you end up having people, they clamor for strength, they clamor for some kind of national leader, And sometimes they clamor for someone who vilifies a certain segment of the public and says, oh, it's just these people caused the problem, instead of analyzing the problem. So I think we do face those times. I don't know how quickly or how bad the inflation will be, but I think when you double your monetary base in the period of a 3 or 4 month period last year, that's pretty worrisome as to what you will finally get when it filters out into the economy.
I was speaking to a number of people because, we bring the top people in the world on from the financial world each week on this show. But talking to them, and we talk about this inflation or this great debasement, as you go through that, many of them have said to me, it ends often with a man on a white horse, as you said. So if you look at a Napoleon, or forgetting Hitler for a minute, if you look at a Napoleon, his first act was to basically create the Napoleon gold coin, and it was very stabilizing. But then again, that dictatorship ended in wars and ended in destruction for France. So in the end here, what we're really talking about is, as you have this kind of chaos, if it continues unabated, how will our republic exist or continue to exist? Because you're talking in the end then about a dictatorship or something of that nature if you go too far down that path, right, Rand?
Well, I think recently Rahm Emanuel, Obama's chief lieutenant, said, let no crisis go past without taking advantage of it. And that's really truly the danger, and that was the danger after the attacks on 9/11, is that the crisis was not left unanswered, and out of the crisis, government grows. People readily line up to turn in their liberty for security. And, the old Ben Franklin quote is, if you turn in your liberty for security, you'll have neither. And so we do have to be wary of that. And we have to be wary that there are a lot of people who believe that government is the answer. And when crisis comes, that's the time to ratchet things up. I mean, we had the banking crisis. So now they're talking about giving the Federal Reserve more power. You have some who want to audit the Fed, but the interesting or sort of irony here will be that it may be that the audit the Fed bill gets tacked on to a bill that increases the Fed's powers enormously to do things they haven't been doing.
What compelled you to run for Senate? Meaning you've seen your father fighting to uphold our republic and our Constitution and so on, which has been an uphill battle, right? What made you want to do this?
I think worry and concern over the size and enormity of the debt. We've been doing this for a while, but things are really getting out of control now. And I think that there will be a time sooner rather than later. I don't think we're looking at something that is decades away from a problem. I think we're looking at that we've been through an enormous bank panic in the last year. Some say we show signs of coming out of this recession. I would say that if we do come out of this at all, it will be an inflationary mini boom, and it may last a year or two, but it won't see a significant recovery, but then we'll immediately maybe drop into another cycle. So, we had a 5 or 6 year cycle after the dot-com bust because they lowered interest rates, and we're doing the same thing now. We have virtually 0% interest rates from the Federal Reserve. We've had a lot of money put into the system, so we have easy credit again, and, the old mantra was that Keynesianism works in the short run. And then when Keynes was asked what happens in the long run, he responded, in the long run, we'll all be dead. I think there still is some truth to that. Keynesianism can work in the short run, and whether or not it will work very successfully this time, I think it'll have less success each time you do it. So, for example, the Keynesians had, and the central bankers had some success from 2002 to 2006, 2007, but they built in a significant crash in the housing market. They're doing the exact same thing again. The question is can they even create a boom in this given circumstances with high unemployment, or will we maybe get sort of stagflation where you get inflation and you get no growth? And there's a real possibility of that.
Well, I think also when you mention the Fed or some of these policies that have been put into place here, and the attempt to basically, because what you're really talking about in the end, Rand, it almost sounds like you're an Austrian economist to me. I don't want to put that on you, but it almost sounds to me like that's the direction you lean in. So if you're trying to stop these natural forces, meaning you've got these massive excesses built into the system, and the system is setting up to cleanse them out, and every time there's going to be a cleansing, the government steps in and the Fed steps in and says, no, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. We're just going to keep this bubble floating along. The question in the end becomes, do you exacerbate ultimately the decline, number one, And then number two, looking at the Japanese model, they're saying, well, yeah, the Japanese tried to do this, right, Rand, because they had, 2 decades of their stock market plunging within various counter-trend rallies. But really, what did it do? Top to bottom, down 85% or so. And they're still down massively from their highs today as we speak, even with the rally. So why would the United States feel like we can have that one downward motion and then have this bounce, and everybody's so euphoric now. They all feel like, well, that's it. We're done. The bear market's really over. We're not going to break those lows, and everything's going to be fine going forward. I mean, that's just not based in reality, is it?
Well, the real question is, and my father always points this out, is do you want to take the predictions and advice of the people